So with the Dune Awakening beta coming to a close, I wanted to take a moment to sit down and talk about some of my opinions about it. Thus far I've ingested a lot of the marketing material they've released for it, I've seen some streams of it, and then I've played a bunch of it myself over this weekend. And so I want to talk about my experiences and some of my thoughts about where I think this game is going to land when it comes out basically a month from now. And obviously the best place to start is just to talk about the fundamental gameplay experience, which, to be blunt, is really all that we got to experience in this sort of semi-public beta weekend. The combat system is a non-directional melee system with a gunplay element that is more positioning, dodging, parrying based. So if you are someone who is very familiar with playing Souls games and the like, you will probably have more affinity with the system than if you are, a hardcore Last Oasis player or a big Mountain Blade enjoyer and you really, really like directional combat systems. Personally, I don't. That's just my opinion. If you like directional combat systems, you will probably hate this game. That's just my prediction. If you enjoy Souls games and games that have that sort of combat system, you will probably like Dune Awakening. The game also utilizes a soft target lock system, which I found worked about 90 to 95% of the time. The biggest issue I had with it was that when there was lag, it tended to become dysfunctional, but that's sort of a different story I'll talk about later on. You're given a fast attack and you're given a slow attack. The slow blade penetrates the shield as it is in, the movies and then the Dune IP as a whole. The slow attack is how you get shielded opponents. The fast attack is how you hit unshielded opponents and how you try to stagger shielded opponents. 3 light hits turns into a stagger, which allows you to do a heavy hit. If you're staggered, you can dodge out of it. And of course, you can parry attacks. That causes your opponent to be staggered and hopefully not you. Again, there were some networking issues. I noticed that at some points I would parry things and then I would get staggered and the enemy would get staggered. So that's cool. But again, obviously unintended. The system as designed works fine. It is playable. It is, I would say, to some degree enjoyable. The biggest problem is that, at least from the PvE side of things, especially with regards to what's shown publicly in the beta, the PvE, once you get good at it, is extremely easy. And if you are someone who is good at using this kind of combat system, the PvE will probably always be extremely easy for you. And I suspect that they will be hard-pressed to come up with challenges for people who master the system or who are just naturally good at the system. On the gunplay side of things, if you don't have a shield, then you shoot things and they die. Simple enough. Against opponents who have shields, there are items like the Destructor, which is basically their SMG class weapon that is better at killing shields and disabling them than other weapons, but generally speaking, the idea here is you cannot kill an opponent who has a shield with a gun unless you overpower the shield with a large amount of firepower to run out the power pack of the person who has the shield, effectively disabling their shield and giving you the opportunity to shoot them without it. This is not technically lore accurate. It's also, as far as I'm aware, not lore accurate. This actually is depicted in the movie as well, believe it or not. And it is something that, to my understanding, they obviously got permission from the estate to do. I don't really have an issue with it. Practically, the system seems fine. It's something that is going to be more concerning when you're going to endgame PvP, but I have a suspicion that there's going to be some issues that arise because, especially with opponents that you can disable the shield for or are unshielded, the firearms are extremely powerful and there are a lot of bonuses that you can get that basically allow you to one-hit things. If you look at my streams, especially the second one, I'm basically running around with the shotgun that I found and a 25, I think 35% total bonus to firearms, maybe actually more than that, where I use my suspensor to hover and I shoot them with the shotgun and they just immediately die because I'm doing 40 or whatever plus % damage with the shotgun. And every PvE target that I shoot that doesn't have a shield up is immediately dead as a result. If you shoot a firearm in the game, your shield goes down for a brief moment because you can't shoot through a shield, obviously. You can just wait for an opponent to shoot a weapon and blast them in the face with the shotgun, and they immediately die. And so that's kind of my experience with the PvE system as a whole. It's, again, really kind of trivial. But it is also, in my opinion, kind of fun. It's one of those things where I would prefer that it was more difficult, and I would prefer that the AI were more reactive and more of a challenge for the player. But yet at the same time, there is a certain enjoyment to be found sort of running around and murdering the crap out of PvE targets. And so if you enjoy that kind of thing, again, you'll probably enjoy this game. If you are someone who desperately needs the PvE to be challenging, it seems to me like the implication is that they are relying on PvP to kind of make up the difference there. And while I can't have a PvP experience because I wasn't able to actually find any PvP, I suspect that the PvP is going to run into some problems when it comes to finding a balance between melee and non-melee combat. And my suspicion is that non-melee combat is probably going to win that fight. We'll see how that pans out. The other thing is I have a feeling that there's probably going to be a lot of vectors for like ability abuses and imbalances that are going to become a bit of a problem in PvP. So again, we'll see how that pans out. Last thing to talk about is the game's movement. Movement in the game is really good. The climbing system works fine. The suspensors are extremely good from what I've experienced, and when you couple that with some of the movement abilities that are in the game, like the knee charge and the Shigawire Claw that I showed off in one of the videos I jokingly made, you, again, basically turn this into a Spider-Man sim, which is fun in its own way. It's very satisfying. About just general survival sandbox elements, it's a survival sandbox game. It has all of the usual things that you would expect from a survival sandbox game. You run around, you collect rocks. I do think that the mining system in the game is one of the best mining systems that I've played with. I think the mining system sits in a perfect intersection between a mining system that has a minigame component to it, but the minigame is not disruptive. And it is also slightly more interesting than just man hits rock with pickaxe. You are basically flipping your laser across the line that they show you and instantly breaking the rock and getting a bunch of stuff for it, and that feels nice. The base construction is perfectly serviceable. I think that it lacks some creature comforts compared to some more modern games, like being able to press buttons to snap to different local areas. But aside from that, the ability to make a base and kind of gussy it up with some decorations and stuff like that, all that's there. I think that the parts that they give you access to look really nice. They give you a nice variety of them. There are some pieces that I feel like might be missing a little bit. I know that they have like an Atreides and a Harkonnen set as well. I don't know if they'll probably introduce more building sets that you can get later in. For the purposes of the beta, they only give you access to the basic building set, which is kind of, it's basic. And then they give you a like very concrete, like a Chome building set, a more advanced one. And that looks pretty nice. I think that the sets that they have look nice. And I think if you like building, there's probably something here for you that you're going to enjoy. The game didn't feel too grindy, but again, only got access to the beginning tutorial region and then literally the second region. So 2 technology tiers out of, I think it's 7 total or something like that. At least for those first 2 regions, it didn't feel very grindy. It felt like you could push through them very, very quickly. There are a lot of resources that you need to get through PvE. Again, fairly typical. A lot of the products that you're making to craft things are refinements of resources that you mine out in the world. And then you also have the addition of needing to loot certain items from various points of interest, like caves, labs, and enemy outposts, and shipwrecks. And so you go to those places, you kill NPCs, you do your PvE, you loot chests, and then you get some free items, you get the resources that you need to craft stuff, and then you get some blueprints for stuff like unique items that have special abilities or special stats to them. Things like boots that generate slightly less worm threat when you're walking on the sand, stuff like that. Burst fire rifles, etc., etc. The survival elements themselves are interesting, but extremely underwhelming, to be honest. The first element is line of sight with the sun. If you are visible to the sun, if you're not in a shadow, and the system for this is good and it works quite well. And it also works on things like vehicles and stuff, so you can hide behind your vehicle to avoid getting sunstroke. When you get sunstroked, you start to dehydrate very rapidly. When you dehydrate, you start to lose health and whatnot, and then you can die. The sunstroke mechanic on foot is fine and kind of interesting and does sort of propel you to making certain kinds of choices. However, once you get a sand bike, that basically stops being relevant entirely. And that may sound strange because the sand bike has no coverage to prevent you from being seen by the sun. However, it just doesn't matter if you're on a sand bike, you can't get sunstroked. That system becomes irrelevant the moment you get a vehicle, which you are required to do in order to get out of the tutorial region anyways. So, whatever. On the dehydration side of things, you can top up your first level of water from plants, the little dew plants that are around. You can also drink blood. This one gives you a negative modifier to your maximum health if you drink blood, so you can basically play this game like a vampire, I guess. The problem then pretty much immediately becomes that it is actually quite easy to get water on Arrakis, as it turns out, because you can just drink blood and get a whole bunch of water that way, and the challenge of hydration kind of goes out the window for the most part. Once you get a dew reaper, and at nighttime you are then able to collect water from dew plants, and the device does look really cool when you're using it, but it also kind of trivializes the game since you can just go out at night and collect a whole bunch of water in one go. The vehicles feel good for the most part. The sand bike's a little weird and it's a little bit wobbly when it goes over objects, so it can be kind of a little bit iffy, but like when you're on straights and when you're not making like super tight turns, it feels fine. It turns really, really, really tightly, like way too tightly, but overall it feels fine. I did get access to the buggy because there was a way to steal one. Probably the vast majority of people didn't actually realize that you could do because it's kind of hidden. I was able to steal one and drive it around a little bit. The buggy feels really good. It's decently fast. I didn't get eaten when I was going over large sand areas by the worm. It feels nice. It goes over rocks and stuff not quite as horribly as the sand bike does. The vehicle physics, from what I saw, seemed fine. The ornithopter is obviously going to be a make it or break it. I didn't get access to that. I don't know. Unfortunate, sad, is what it is. The music seems fine. Not really a whole lot that I could say there. What I heard, didn't have a problem with. Some of the sound design and sound effects are really good. There are a lot of things that I liked. I would say far more things that I liked as far as audio goes in this game than I would say otherwise. The UI I generally approve of. It's fairly sleek and modern without being ridiculous. It works for what they're doing. Otherwise, it's a fairly typical survival sandbox game and has pretty typical survival sandbox UI. There's not too much to say there other than it looks fine. It's fairly low profile too when you're actually doing gameplay, which is good. As far as visuals go and general game stability and frames, I thought that the game ran more or less fairly fine, with some exceptions of some slowdowns for things like when the worm passes. It wasn't uncommon for me to see a little bit of jittering there. All of this is in spite of it using Unreal Engine 5, which compared to every other UE5 game I've played, this is by far the standout, and I guess proves that it is technically possible to create a UE5 game that doesn't run like shit. So good for Funcom, I suppose. Visually, the graphics are more on the stylized side. It's not photoreal, and it is a good-looking game. I think it looks gorgeous. I think it looks nice. There are not a lot of things that I would have to say here other than I like it visually. Bridging off that, the 3D model work looks pretty good to me. There's some stuff that's sort of more of a retro sci-fi sort of aesthetic, I would say. So some of it's kind of dorky if you're used to more modern stuff. But Dune's from the 60s, so I'm not going to complain about that. Some of the armor sets look really cool. Some of them look kind of weird, but they're like, scavenger stuff and like really like tier 1 armor kind of looks shitty, but not shitty in like they're modeled poorly, but just shitty in that like, you're literally wearing rags shitty. As far as story goes and side quests and stuff like that, the story seemed fine. The presentation was okay. There's a lot of like audio logs and stuff that you kind of go for lore and to kind of understand like what's been going on in some of the places that you visit. I wouldn't say it was super compelling, but I wouldn't say it's bad either. I'm kind of neutral on what I saw story-wise. Again, only got to see the first 2 regions of like 7 levels of tech tree and who knows how much story. There's like social hubs that I was not able to visit. So there's a lot more there. What I saw gives me the impression that it could be pretty decent or it could be good. I don't think that it'll end up being bad. The voice acting seemed fine, didn't have an issue with that. The characters seemed okay. They seemed decently interesting. Overall, the game felt very Dune-y to me. I've read most of the books up to God Emperor of Dune. I have a generally good idea of what's in there. I've seen all the movies. As far as like all that stuff goes, on the lore side of things, when you're making a video game, usually some lore has to be fudged a little bit to make things work. That's just the nature of the beast. They're doing an alternate reality thing. From what I've seen, what they've laid out mostly makes sense. It's all, for better or worse, approved by the estate, from what I understand. Aside from that, I've seen people complain, oh, there's no ground cars in Dune, there's no guns in Dune. Yes, there are. They're in the books. To be blunt, most of the things I've seen people complain about when it comes to Dune lore in this game literally are in the books. Since the David Lynch movie exists, I feel like I can safely say that I don't think Frank Herbert would honestly care all that much anyways. Overall, I think that the spirit of the IP is there, and I think that they adhered as best they could while trying to make this game. That was my general impression. On the networking side of things is where stuff gets a little bit more troubled. And since the game is coming out in a month, I feel justified in saying that there are going to be some problems. Saturday's test, it got really bad. During play on Friday, early in the day, it wasn't so bad. Probably a lot of people were still working at the time. I think pop on my server was fairly low. Probably across the whole network was a little bit lower. On Saturday, it was, I'm sure, hustling and bustling, and it was laggy. And the desync started to roll in pretty hard, and you could feel the networking bugs starting to crack in. Things like I mentioned before, pairing and getting staggered despite the fact that you successfully parried and stuff like that. Do I think that they can fix that by the 10th? No, absolutely not. I think that they can smooth it over, but I think that there's going to be some problems there. Big picture, do I think that they have a potentially successful game on their hands? I think it's going to be a little bit more in the middle. I think that it's a fun and interesting game that I think a lot of people will like. I think that if you are a big fan of survival sandbox games, you will probably enjoy this, especially if you like PvE. If you want more interesting PvE elements, I think you're going to be disappointed, but you might still have fun anyways. Maybe, it just depends. I think that if you are a big-time PvPer and you love PvE and you want PvP everywhere, you're probably going to hate this game. They've told us bits and pieces of what their plan is for their big, deep desert PvP thing. Seeing what's there, what's in the game, the little vestiges of it that we're able to glance at, and hearing some of what they said, I think that having come off of games like Atlas and Last Oasis, and I play Eve, obviously, if you've looked at any of the content that I make, you know that I've played quite a bit of Eve. I don't see it. I just don't. And it's a hard thing to say, but I don't see that working as what's described. I think that ultimately Atlas and Last Oasis have both effectively failed. They are games that were far more PvP first, very heavily based around territory control, and if they can't do it, I just don't see that happening here either. Having strong and satisfying PvE elements and then having things like PvP territory control are both very, very important if you want to make this kind of game, much like EVE Online does to most extent, I would say. This game doesn't have those elements as far as I can tell. I don't see that plan coming to fruition as a result. I think if they want this game to be successful in the long term, they're probably going to need content expansions that heavily focus on really interesting PvE raids and content, and maybe introduce some sort of territory control mechanic that's interesting. But the problem is there's also a lot of fundamental issues with territory control mechanics. So, that's hell they're wading into, basically. But overall, I think that there's going to be a more middle-of-the-ground appreciation for this game where people who like what's there are going to like it, and people who want a more hardcore PvE experience are going to be unhappy, and people who want a PvP experience are also probably going to be unhappy. But this is just my impressions. I could be completely wrong, but I suspect that that's what we're going to find ends up happening when this game comes out in about a month. Also, I do expect this game will probably be carried for many years, as seems to be the case with Conan Exiles and stuff. They've supported that game for a long time. I don't think that Dune Awakening is going to be an abject failure or anything. I think that they're going to have a lot of time and excuses to continue to create content since they intend for this to be a live service game. And they have already talked about some expansions, so I am imagining that there will be some big updates that will come out in the ensuing years and hopefully make the game far more interesting for new buyers and for people who already purchased it on launch day and then immediately dropped it, as people tend to do. But that's all I really have to say on it, and hopefully that helps somebody out there formulate an opinion about whether or not they want to spend the $50 or more if you want to get one of the fancier packs. Oh, I'm dead. Ooh, I'm dead. I'm so dead. Ooh, I'm actually not dead. Holy shit.